Chapter 1. The Night She Lost Everything. The rain had a way of swallowing sound in Dust Hollow. It wasn't a soft, forgiving kind of rain, but a cold, relentless downpour that turned the dirt roads into veins of mud and memory. A single rider pushed through it, Clara Jenkins, 38, tall and wiry, shoulders squared like someone who'd forgotten how to bow to the world. Her long brown hair clung to her face, strands glued by rain, framing eyes the color of fading stormlight. Once those eyes had belonged to a woman who laughed easily and believed in good seasons. Now they belonged to someone who had buried too many dreams to count. Beside her trotted a German shepherd named Rusty, 5 years old, his black and tan coat slick with rain, ears sharp as blades. He limped slightly from an old wound. Clara never spoke of how he got it, but when thunder rolled, Rusty always pressed close to her leg, trembling just once before he steadied himself. Loyal to the bone, the dog had been her shadow since the day her husband left, and the bank took the farm. They passed shuttered windows, pale glows flickering behind curtains. Dust Hollow was a town that forgot kindness when money ran dry. The wooden sign of May's Diner creaked in the wind, its paint peeling, but its coffee always hot. That was what Clara remembered from better days. She dismounted, boots sinking into the mud, and pushed the door open. The little bell above it jingled like a memory that didn't want to fade. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease wrapped around her like a ghost of comfort. Behind the counter stood Earl Peterson, a heavy-set man with a red face and a white apron that strained over his belly. He had replaced old Mrs. May after she took ill, and unlike her, Earl didn't believe in second chances. His mustache twitched when he saw the mud dripping from Clara's coat. "We're closed," he grunted. Clara's voice was soft but steady. "Just looking for work. I can wash dishes, serve tables, anything." Earl wiped his hands slowly on a rag, eyes narrowing. "Don't hire drifters, and sure as hell don't hire women who drag dogs into my place." He nodded toward Rusty, who sat obediently by the door, tail still, amber eyes alert. "He's quiet," Clara said. "He's better company than most men." Earl chuckled, a sound like gravel. "That might be true, but quiet don't pay the bills. Try the boarding house, if they'll have you." She hesitated. "They won't." Something in her tone, flat, resigned, made Earl pause, but only for a second. Then he reached for the door and held it open. "Then I guess you're out of luck, ma'am." The bell jingled again as she stepped back into the storm. By the time she reached the edge of town, snow had started falling, thick, heavy flakes that erased the world in silence. Clara's fingers were numb around the reins. The horse shivered beneath her, an old mare as worn as its rider. "Just a little further, girl," she whispered. Rusty barked once, low and urgent, as if answering. They found the barn behind a long-abandoned ranch, its roof half-caved and hay black with damp. Clara led the horse inside, removed its saddle, then spread her coat over a pile of straw. Rusty circled twice before lying down beside her, his breath fogging in the cold. She looked at him and managed a small smile. "You know," she murmured, "you could have gone with him. You would have had meat, a real home." Rusty lifted his head, eyes reflecting the faint lantern light. Then, with quiet certainty, he laid his muzzle across her wrist. His warmth pulsed against her skin like a promise. "I stay." For a long time, neither of them moved. The wind howled through the cracks, whistling songs of empty fields and broken fences. Clara stared up at the beams above her, tracing the shadows with her eyes. Every creak sounded like a question she didn't want to answer. She thought of her husband, Tom Jenkins, broad-shouldered, charming, and cowardly. The kind of man who smiled too easily and left too quietly. He'd taken the money meant for the mortgage, the trust she'd built, and vanished down the railroad line without looking back. She'd learned something that day. Love, when it walks away, doesn't slam the door. It leaves it open so the wind can finish the job. Now, with snow gathering on her boots and the smell of hay and rain around her, Clara realized she wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Too tired to hate, too tired to dream. Rusty shifted beside her, a small sound in his throat, almost like a sigh. "Sleep, boy," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. Outside, the storm deepened. Far off, a coyote howled, a lonely, piercing sound that slid through the cracks of the barn like a knife. Rusty's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Clara's eyelids grew heavy. Just before sleep took her, a faint light flickered beyond the barn doors, moving, steady, too human to be moonlight. a lantern swinging in the snow. Rusty lifted his head and growled low, the sound rolling deep in his chest. Clara sat up, heart pounding. The shape outside stopped moving. Silence fell. Then, slowly, the barn door creaked open and a shadow stepped in. Clara reached for the rifle that wasn't there. Rusty's growl deepened. The shadow hesitated, then spoke in a rough, unfamiliar voice, low, like gravel dragged across stone. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be here." Clara froze. The man stepped into the light, revealing a weathered face lined with scars and a gray stubble beard. He wore a soldier's coat, torn at the shoulder, eyes dark as the storm outside. Rusty barked once, sharp and warning. The man didn't flinch. He just looked at Clara, then at the dog, then back at her again. "Because," he said, voice almost breaking, "this place, it ain't as empty as it looks." And somewhere, behind him, faint but certain, another sound stirred, a slow, dragging shuffle in the dark, like boots on frozen ground. Clara's breath caught. Rusty's fur bristled. The lantern light flickered. Then everything went still. Chapter 2. The Stranger by the Frozen River. The morning broke gray and silent, the kind of silence that comes after a storm has taken everything it wanted. Clara awoke to the sound of Rusty's low growl. The barn smelled of wet hay and cold iron. The man from last night, his presence still a blur in her half-dreaming mind, was gone. Only his footprints remained, half buried in the new snow. Clara stepped outside, the cold biting through her coat, and scanned the horizon. That's when she saw it, a horse bolting through the snowdrifts, reins flailing. A dark shape lay near the frozen riverbank. She ran. Rusty bounded ahead, his paws sinking deep into the slush, barking once as if to confirm her fear. The man lay face down in the snow, one arm twisted awkwardly, his coat soaked and frozen. His horse had slipped on the ice and thrown him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. "Easy," Clara murmured, kneeling beside him. His face was gaunt and sharp-edged, with a short beard that hadn't been cared for in months. His hair was black streaked with gray, matted from the fall. There was a soldier's look about him, someone used to hunger and hard sleep. She rolled him carefully onto his back. His eyelids fluttered open. "You again," he muttered, voice thick with pain. "I could say the same," she replied, checking his pulse. He tried to sit up, but she pressed a hand to his chest. "Don't move, you'll crack your ribs worse." Rusty circled, whining, then grabbed the man's torn coat with his teeth, tugging as if to help. Clara smiled faintly. "He likes you," she said. The man managed a breath that might have been a laugh. "Lucky me." She saw the ice cracking near the edge of the river and knew they had little time. "Rusty, pull!" she commanded. The dog dug in, his muscles straining. Clara wrapped her arms under the man's shoulders and dragged him onto firmer ground. They collapsed together in the snow, both panting. "Name's Luke," he gasped. "Luke Harper." "Clara Jenkins," she said. "You're freezing. We need fire." With trembling fingers, she gathered driftwood and struck her last match beneath a scrap of cloth. The flame caught, hesitant, then grew. She guided him closer, peeled back his coat, and saw the dark bruise spreading across his ribs. Rusty lay beside him, tail thumping gently, as if to guard his recovery. Luke studied Clara through the flickering light. Her cheeks were flushed from cold, her hair tangled but fierce, like the prairie itself, wild, refusing to yield. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said softly. "Wasn't planning to be," she replied. "Plans change." When the fire steadied, she looked him over properly. He had the frame of a man who had once been strong, but worn thin by guilt. There was something haunted behind his dark blue eyes, something that never slept. His hands were scarred, a small tattoo faded along one knuckle. Military emblem. "You a soldier?" she asked. "Was," he said. "Didn't end well." She didn't press further. Some pains didn't need company. By noon, the snow began to fall again, soft and fine like dust. Luke tried to stand but staggered. Clara caught him by the arm. "You've got a concussion. Where's home?" He pointed toward the north ridge, where the river bent around a grove of dead cottonwoods. "Cabin. Few miles that way." "Then we'd better move," she said. She slung his arm over her shoulder, half carrying him through the drifts. Rusty trotted ahead, leading the way with uncanny instinct. The journey took an hour, maybe more. Time lost meaning under the white sky. When they finally reached a small log cabin by the frozen river, Clara almost wept from relief. It was humble but solid, stone chimney, porch sagging but alive with the smell of wood smoke. A single lantern burned inside. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and led Luke in. The cabin spoke of another life. There were books on the shelf, boots by the door too small for Luke's size, and a faded photograph on the mantel of a woman with kind eyes holding a baby. Dust lay over everything, but the grief was fresh, like it had never really left. Luke sank into a chair by the hearth, wincing. "She was my wife," he said quietly, catching her gaze before she could look away. "Mary. Fever took her 2 winters ago, and our boy, Sam. Same week." His jaw clenched. "Sometimes I think I stayed behind by mistake." Clara didn't answer. She simply added wood to the fire, letting the silence fill what words couldn't. Rusty patted over, resting his head on Luke's knee. The man's fingers hesitated, then slowly scratched behind the dog's ear. Something softened in his face, a crack in the stone. "Guess he forgives easy," Luke said. "Rusty doesn't hold grudges," Clara replied. "Wish I could say the same." She peeled off her gloves, her fingers red and raw, and began hanging wet clothes by the hearth. Luke watched her move, efficient, uncomplaining. "You lost something too," he said quietly. She froze for a second, then nodded. "A farm, a husband, not sure which one I miss less." That drew a hoarse chuckle from him. "You talk like someone who has been burned before, more like frozen." He looked toward the window, where the snow whispered against the glass. "You saved me," he said finally. "Can't repay that with words." "You can stay alive," she said. "That'll be payment enough." He gestured toward a narrow hallway. "There's soup on the stove, old but edible. Guest bed's clean. Take it. I'll manage here." "I didn't drag you from a river to watch you freeze again," she said, tone firm. "Eat first." He gave her a faint, lopsided smile. "You always this stubborn?" "Only when I'm right." As dusk settled, the river outside glowed blue beneath the last light. The cabin grew warmer, the kind of warmth that seeps deeper than skin. Luke drifted into uneasy sleep by the fire, murmuring names that no longer answered. Clara sat at the table, staring into the flames, feeling something she hadn't in a long time. Safety. Or maybe it's ghost. Rusty stirred, ears pricked, his gaze fixed on the window. Outside, beyond the frozen river, a shadow moved between the trees, tall, deliberate, carrying a lantern. Clara turned, her breath catching. "Luke," she whispered. He didn't wake. Rusty growled, low and warning. The lantern stopped. Then, just as suddenly, it went out, and the world fell quiet again. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Empty House. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of work and silence. The snow melted into muddy furrows, and the river began to move again, whispering beneath its thawing skin. Clara rose early each morning, her breath misting in the cold light, while Rusty patrolled the yard like a soldier on duty. The dog was healing from a small cut on his paw, but nothing slowed him. His nose never stopped twitching, his gaze always scanning the tree line. Luke watched from the porch, his body still stiff from the fall, though his strength returned slowly. He had started shaving again. The rough beard now trimmed close, revealing a face marked by weather and time, creased lines that spoke of both endurance and regret. Clara had turned the small patch of dirt behind the cabin into something resembling a garden. She planted hardy vegetables, turnips, onions, beans, while Luke repaired the fence and patched the roof. It was strange, almost domestic, like they were pretending to live lives that weren't already broken. When she smiled, even briefly, Luke felt a quiet ache in his chest, something old and unhealed. But whenever he tried to speak it, she'd change the subject. The nearest town lay 3 miles west. Luke rode there once a week for supplies, always alone. He returned with whispers, how the townsfolk had begun to talk. A woman staying with a widowed man by the river? The words spread like weeds. One evening he brought it up while Clara was kneading bread dough. "They're saying things," he muttered. Clara didn't look up. "Let them. You don't care? I've been called worse than a rumor," she said, rolling the dough harder. Her tone was calm, but her hands trembled slightly, dusting the table with flour like snow. "People talk when they're bored. Talking keeps them from thinking about their own sins." Luke didn't answer. He just watched her, realizing she had a kind of strength that didn't need defending. Quiet, bone deep, forged from loss. Later that night, Rusty began growling again. It was a deep, rolling sound, different from his usual warning. Clara stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. The moonlight painted everything silver. The fields were empty, except for the faint smell of oil. "Luke," she called softly. He appeared behind her, pulling on his coat. "What is it?" She crouched near the fence post, touching the damp soil. Her fingers came away slick, smelling of kerosene. Her heart lurched. "Someone's been here!" Before Luke could answer, Rusty barked, a single, sharp cry that sliced the air. Then came the crackle. Flames erupted near the barn. Luke grabbed a bucket. Clara followed, throwing snow and mud onto the growing fire. The smoke burned their throats. Rusty darted dangerously close, dragging a blanket toward the flames, as if he understood. Sparks leapt into the sky, wild and alive. "Keep low!" Luke shouted, coughing hard. His shirt caught a spark. Clara slapped it out with her bare hands. The barn's sidewall collapsed inward, the heat searing their faces. But finally, after what felt like hours, the fire died down. They fell to their knees in the mud, gasping. Rusty limped to Clara and pressed against her chest. She buried her face into his fur, shaking. Luke stared at the blackened wood, jaw tight. "That wasn't an accident." "No," Clara said. Her voice was steady now, cold as the river. "Someone wanted us gone." They sat in silence as dawn crept across the valley. Luke's hands trembled when he finally spoke. "My wife used to say this land was cursed. The war took everything. But this place, it took more. Maybe she was right." Clara looked at him, really looked. His eyes seemed older in the pale light, like he carried the weight of 2 lifetimes. "You fought in the war?" He nodded. 15 years ago, frontier regiment. I came home with nothing but nightmares and a gun I don't use anymore." He paused, staring at the river. "Mary tried to heal me. She thought planting a garden could fix what war had done, but fever took her before the flowers ever bloomed." Clara's throat tightened. "You loved her." "Still do," he said quietly, "and I hate myself for it." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke from the ruins of the barn. She turned away, blinking fast. "I used to dream of a farm too," she said. "Not much. Just a patch of land and a man who stayed. Thought I found it once. Turns out, I found a liar instead." "Your husband?" She nodded. "Tom Jenkins. He left when the debts came. Didn't even leave a note. The bank took everything else." Luke stared into the dying embers. "Maybe that's why ghosts find us," he said, "because we never learned to let go." Rusty shifted, ears twitching. A log cracked in the fire. For a while, no one spoke. The morning light turned the river silver again, calm, deceitful. By noon, they'd cleaned what they could of the wreckage. Luke hammered new boards where the flames had eaten through the wall. Clara's hands were blistered, her hair wild from smoke and sweat, but she worked beside him without complaint. Rusty followed in every step, his paw wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from Clara's shirt. That evening, they sat by the fire inside the cabin. Luke poured 2 mugs of coffee. The silence between them felt different now, less like distance, more like understanding. "You should leave," Luke said finally, "before this gets worse." Clara met his eyes. "You want me gone?" "No, but whoever came last night might come again. Then we'll be ready next time." He looked at her across the flickering light. The woman who had dragged him from a river stood against fire and still refused to break. There was something fierce and unyielding about her, something the world hadn't managed to take. Outside, the wind carried a faint sound, like a horse's whinny, far off, fading into the dark. Rusty's ears perked, but he didn't move. Luke stared at the door for a long moment, then said, "You ever wonder if ghosts walk the same roads we do?" Clara smiled faintly. "If they do, they're watching us try not to make the same mistakes." He nodded, eyes distant. "Let's hope they forgive easier than we do." The fire crackled low. Rusty shifted closer to the door, nose twitching. Clara followed his gaze, and saw, for the briefest second, the glint of something metallic by the river's edge. It caught the moonlight, shimmered, and was gone. She didn't say a word, but her pulse quickened. And outside, somewhere beyond the frost and shadows, the ghosts of Dust Hollow were not resting easy. Chapter 4. The Wounds That Brought Us Close. The storm that had haunted Dust Hollow gave way to a brittle calm. The sky stretched wide and pale, the kind that promised both mercy and menace. For the first time in weeks, sunlight spilled through the cracks of the rebuilt barn, turning the blackened boards to gold. Luke Harper stood outside, a rifle balanced against his shoulder, scanning the ridge where the hills curved toward the open range. The cattle he had managed to keep since the war, grazed in nervous clusters, tails swishing, ears twitching at every sound. Luke had always been a man who listened more than he spoke. Years in battle had trained him to read silence better than words. But that morning, silence turned against him. Rusty, once steady, obedient, suddenly stiffened, his furs bristling. The dog's low growl rolled through the air. "Easy, boy," Luke murmured, tightening his grip on the rifle. 3 riders appeared over the rise, their horses dark against the pale light. The one in front was Clay Danner, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and a scar across his cheek, a remnant from a knife fight in the mining camps. Clay had once served with Lukey in the same regiment before turning to banditry. He had the look of a man who believed the world owed him something and planned to take it back by force. "Luke Harper," Clay called, voice lazy but edged with threat. "Heard you were playing farmer now. Thought we'd come visit." Luke's stomach tightened. "You're trespassing," Clay laughed. "Just checking if that river of yours still feeds good cattle. Might be some of them wandered our way." Rusty barked sharply, taking a step forward. Luke's jaw flexed. "You've had your fun. Turn around." Clay spat into the dirt. "Always the soldier, ain't you? Tell you what, I'll take 2 of them cows as toll, and we'll be on our way." Luke didn't move. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of gun oil. "You're not taking a thing." The standoff broke with the crack of a rifle. Luke dove for cover behind a trough as bullets bit into the wood. Rusty leapt, barking, circling toward the riders to draw their aim. One shot caught the ground near him, spraying mud. Luke fired back, one clean shot that struck a rider's arm. Clay cursed, wheeling his horse. "Harper, you damn fool," he shouted. "This ain't over." Another bullet sang through the air. Luke felt it tear across his side, hot, clean, and deep. He dropped to one knee, blood blooming across his shirt. The riders turned and fled into the hills, dust trailing behind them. Rusty limped back, panting, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. "Rusty!" Luke gasped, reaching out as his vision swam. The dog collapsed beside him, whining softly. Clara's voice cut through the haze. "Luke!" She came running from the house, skirts hitched, hair tumbling loose from its braid. Her face went pale when she saw the blood. God, no. She tore strips from her apron, pressing them to his wound, her hands trembling but sure. "Cows are safe," Luke muttered, trying to smile. "Damn the cows," she snapped. "You're bleeding out." Rusty gave a weak bark as if agreeing. Clara's eyes softened briefly before she lifted the dog into her arms. His weight was solid, warm, and heavy with trust. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of smoke and iron. Clara laid Luke on the bed, then cleaned Rusty's wound first, her hands gentle, her breath steady despite the fear clawing at her ribs. She whispered to the dog as she worked, "You're too stubborn to die, you hear me? We all are." Rusty's tail thumped once against the floor. When she turned to Luke, he was half-conscious, skin ashen. "Stay with me," she ordered. "You survived worse." He tried to speak, but she pressed a hand to his lips. "Don't you dare make jokes now. I'll read you something." She reached for the old Bible on the shelf, its leather cover cracked from years of use. "My mother used to read this when I was scared," she murmured, opening it to Psalms. Her voice, though quiet, filled the room with something stronger than comfort. "He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds." The rhythm of the words steadied her hands. Outside, the river whispered and the sun bled into the snow. Hours passed. Clara stitched the wound, washed the blood, changed the bandages twice. When Luke finally stirred, his voice was barely a whisper. "You stayed." "Didn't have anywhere better to be," she said softly, brushing a damp lock of hair from his forehead. He smiled faintly, a real smile this time, fragile and human. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met." She met his gaze, tired but defiant. "I'm not strong. I just don't have a choice." Rusty, lying at their feet, lifted his head and licked both their hands. It felt almost like a benediction. Later that night, Clara sat by the hearth, reading aloud even after Luke had fallen asleep. The firelight touched his face, carving the lines of pain into something almost peaceful. Outside, the world was quiet. Too quiet. Rusty's ears twitched. He stood, limping toward the door. Clara followed his gaze through the small window. Down by the river, she saw a single horse tied to a tree, no rider. Her heart froze. She reached for the rifle, whispering to the dog, "Stay." But Rusty ignored her, pushing against the door, tail low, growl rumbling deep in his chest. She stepped outside, the night air sharp as glass. The horse whinnied softly, stamping its hooves. The saddle bore a mark, a half circle burned into the leather, Clay Danner's brand. Clara tightened her grip on the rifle. The fire inside the cabin flickered against the window pane. She turned back just once, seeing Luke asleep, Rusty guarding him faithfully. Then she whispered into the darkness, "If you've come back, you won't leave breathing." And for the first time since she'd lost everything, Clara Jenkins felt something fierce and unfamiliar rise inside her. Hope sharpened into resolve. Chapter 5. Storms never ask permission. The wind began howling before dawn, crawling through every crack in the cabin walls like a living thing. The river outside had turned wild, swollen and silver under the angry sky. Clara stood by the window, her hand resting on the rifle that never left her side. Rusty lay on the rug near the door, his shoulder wrapped in clean bandages, breathing slow but steady. Luke still slept, pale and weak, the wound at his side healing slower than she had hoped. The storm felt like a warning, a messenger sent before trouble arrived. By noon, the rain came sideways. The trees bent under its force, and the world disappeared behind a curtain of gray. Clara was feeding the fire when she heard hoofbeats, faint at first, then pounding closer, echoing against the earth like the sound of approaching judgment. Rusty lifted his head, growling low. She crossed the room and peered out. Through the rain, 3 riders took shape, dark, blurred, but unmistakable. One in front rode with his shoulders straight and his hat pulled low. Even from a distance, Clara knew that posture. Owen Grady. The name alone brought bile to her throat. Owen had been her landlord once, the man who'd sold her dreams and then stolen them back with ink and lies. He was in his 50s now, broad but gone soft, a red scarf knotted around his neck, his skin ruddy from whiskey and greed. His gray mustache drooped like a vulture's wings, and his eyes, cold, calculating, searched for weakness the way a wolf hunts for limping prey. Behind him rode 2 hired guns. The first, Jed Coulter, was tall, lean, with a scar that split his upper lip. His fingers twitched near his revolver like a habit he couldn't break. The second, Eli Wade, younger but crueler, had pale eyes that never blinked long enough to show mercy. Clara stepped onto the porch as the riders slowed. Rain soaked through her coat, but she didn't flinch. "You've got no business here," she shouted. Owen smiled, the kind of smile that made her want to pull the trigger. "You're wrong, Mrs. Jenkins. I've got plenty of business. This land was mine before you and that soldier squatted on it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, shielding it from the rain. "Got it right here, signed and sealed. Debt unpaid, property reclaimed." She stared at the paper, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "That's a forgery." He shrugged. "You can tell it to the marshal, if you live long enough." Rusty barked sharply, the sound cutting through the wind. Luke appeared in the doorway, one hand pressed to his bandaged side, his eyes hard despite the pain. "You should turn around, Owen," he said, "before you make another mistake." Owen's smirk widened. "Harper, I figured you'd still be breathing, you stubborn bastard. Heard you used to be a soldier. Shame you're wasting your aim protecting someone else's." "Dirt." Luke raised his rifle slowly, voice low. "I've had enough of men like you owning everything they never earned." For a heartbeat, everything went still. The rain, the wind, even the river seemed to hold its breath. Then Eli fired first. The bullet missed Clara by inches, shattering the porch post beside her. Luke fired back, striking Jed's shoulder. Chaos erupted. The sound of gunfire drowned beneath thunder. Rusty lunged from the doorway, teeth bared, and tore into Eli's arm. The gunman screamed, swinging the butt of his revolver and striking Rusty across the muzzle. Blood splattered against the steps. "Rusty!" Clara cried, firing at Owen. The shot tore through his coat, grazing his arm. Owen cursed, dismounting behind the water trough for cover. Luke stumbled as a bullet ripped through his thigh, dropping him to one knee. The storm raged around them, rain turning the dirt to blood-colored mud. Clara ran to Luke, dragging him behind the woodpile as bullets whined overhead. "Stay down," she ordered, voice breaking. "I can still shoot," he gritted out. Rusty, bleeding heavily now, crawled toward them. His fur was matted, his eyes still fierce with that strange, loyal fire. Clara pressed her hand to his neck, whispering, "Stay with me, boy. Just stay." Then she saw Owen moving, reloading behind the trough, exposed for a single second. She stood, the wind ripping at her hair, and leveled her rifle, her breath slowed, her vision narrowing. "Clara, no!" Luke shouted, But she had already fired. The bullet struck true. Owen staggered backward, eyes wide with disbelief. He fell into the mud, his red scarf blooming darker, his hands still clutching the forged paper that fluttered into the storm and vanished. Eli dropped his gun and fled on horseback, dragging the wounded Jed behind him. Within moments, they were gone, swallowed by rain and distance. Clara fell to her knees beside Rusty. The dog's chest rose and fell unevenly. She pressed her forehead to his, her tears mingling with rain. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered. Luke crawled closer, his face ashen, one hand clamped over his bleeding thigh. "He's strong," he said hoarsely. "He'll make it." Clara tore her scarf into strips and wrapped it tight around Luke's leg, then did the same for Rusty's shoulder. She worked with desperate precision, her hands slick with blood. "Help's coming," she murmured, though there was no one around for miles. But she was wrong. Through the roar of wind, voices rose, shouts carried from down the road. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness. Townsfolk from Dust Hollow, led by Bess Calhoun, the widow who ran the mercantile, and Reverend Pike, an old preacher with a crooked spine but a heart too big for his frail body. They had seen the smoke and ridden through the storm. "Lord Almighty," Reverend Pike gasped, kneeling beside Luke. "Get him inside. And the dog, too. Move." Strong hands lifted. "Luke," others carried Rusty on a torn blanket. The cabin filled with light and noise and urgency. Clara followed, soaked and shaking, the rifle still clutched in her hand. When Luke was settled on the bed and Rusty at his feet, Clara finally sat down, her eyes hollow but alive. Reverend Pike squeezed her shoulder. "You did what had to be done, child. Sometimes the Lord sends storms to wash the lies away." Outside, the thunder rolled toward the horizon. The wind began to die. Clara looked at Luke, unconscious but breathing, and then at Rusty, whose tail twitched faintly in sleep. She closed her eyes, whispering, "Then let this be the last one." But deep down, she knew storms in Dust Hollow never truly ended. Chapter 6, The Day Justice Spoke. The snow began to melt slowly, almost shyly, as if afraid the storm might change its mind and return. The river that had been gray and swollen now shimmered a deep, impossible blue, winding through the valley like a ribbon of forgiveness. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, with her coat wrapped tight, the faint warmth of spring brushing against her cheeks. Rusty sat beside her, his shoulders still bandaged, his fur gleaming under the fragile sunlight. His ears twitched every time the wind carried the faint sound of hooves from the distance, but his tail wagged whenever Clara's hand brushed his head. Inside, Luke Harper sat in the wooden chair near the window. His leg was healing, though he still leaned on a cane Reverend Pike had whittled from hickory. His beard had grown thicker, silver glinting in it, and there was a calm steadiness in his eyes that Clara hadn't seen before. He had started writing again. Short notes, ledgers, sometimes even letters to no one, which he said helped him remember he was still alive. The quiet days that followed the storm were deceptive. Word had spread about Owen Grady's death, and with it came whispers of a trial. Dust Hollow, for all its mercy, demanded order. A month later, a letter arrived from the county judge, Samuel Whitmore, calling Clara to testify in town. Judge Whitmore was known across Wyoming territory for his rigid sense of fairness. A tall, gaunt man in his late 60s, with iron gray hair and a voice that could still the room, he'd been a circuit judge since before the war. His spectacles were cracked at one corner, and he never smiled when he didn't mean it. People said he'd lost his son to bandits years ago, that after that day, justice became his religion. The hearing was set for the first Monday of spring. Clara rose early, the morning of the trial. She wore the same dark coat she'd arrived in months ago, though she'd mended the sleeves and stitched a tiny rose into the hem. Just enough beauty to remind herself she was still a woman, not just a survivor. Luke insisted on coming, though his legs still ached with every step. Rusty trotted between them as they rode into town, the wagon creaking, the air sharp and clear. Dust Hollow looked different that morning. The snow was gone, the ground damp with new grass. The townsfolk watched as the wagon passed. Eyes that once held suspicion now softened with something else: respect. Bess Calhoun stood outside her mercantile, wiping her hands on her apron. "You show them, Clara," she said with a grin. "About time someone did." The courthouse was little more than a long wooden hall, its roof patched with tin, its flag frayed at the edges. Inside, benches were filled. Ranchers, miners, and families pressed close together. Reverend Pike sat in the front row, Bible in hand. whispering a prayer under his breath. When Judge Whitmore entered, the room fell silent. "This hearing," he began, "concerns the death of Owen Grady and the matter of a disputed property claim. Mrs. Clara Jenkins, step forward." Clara stood tall, her back straight, though her stomach twisted with fear. She told her story slowly, how Owen had forged debt papers, how he'd come during the storm with hired guns, how Rusty had defended her and Luke until the shooting stopped. Her voice trembled only once, when she described Rusty bleeding in her arms. The judge listened without expression, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When she finished, he turned to the deputy clerk. "Bring the document." A young deputy, Thomas Avery, no older than 20, with a kind face and ink-stained hands, handed the paper to the judge. Whitmore adjusted his glasses, examining the seal. "This stamp," he said slowly, "belongs to a notary who died 2 years ago." He looked up. "Mrs. Jenkins, you speak truth." A murmur spread through the room. Clara exhaled shakily, her knees weak with relief, but the judge wasn't done. "However, questions remain regarding Mr. Grady's death." Before she could answer, Luke stood, leaning heavily on his cane. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rough but clear, "if anyone bears blame, it's me. I fired first. She was protecting me and our dog. That's no crime in any decent man's eyes." The judge frowned. "And who might you be?" "Luke Harper, former sergeant, 7th Regiment. The woman you see there saved 2 lives that night. Mine, and the only creature on God's earth who still trusts me." Laughter rippled softly from the back benches, not in mockery, but in warmth. Clara felt her throat close. Luke continued, "I spent years killing for orders, Your Honor. Clara Jenkins fights only for what's right. If this town can't see that, then maybe I was wrong to come back from the war." Silence followed. Even the judge seemed to pause longer than usual before he spoke. "Mr. Harper," he said quietly, "Dust Hollow could use more men who speak like that." He turned to Clara. "Mrs. Jenkins, the claim against you is dismissed. This land, by right and by justice, is yours. And as for the death of Owen Grady, it was self-defense, proven beyond doubt." For a moment, no one moved. Then Reverend Pike rose to his feet, clapping once. Others followed, Bess, the blacksmith, the school teacher, even the sheriff. The hall filled with applause, echoing off the rafters like the sound of rain after drought. Clara stood frozen, unsure whether to cry or smile. Luke leaned toward her, whispering, "You're free, Clara." She looked at him, really looked. The scars, the weariness, the quiet courage that had become his strength. "No," she said softly, "we're free." Rusty barked once, tail thumping against the floor. The crowd laughed. When they stepped outside, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The river shimmered below, calm again, reflecting sunlight like glass. Luke reached for her hand without thinking. She didn't pull away. Reverend Pike approached, smiling with a gentleness that broke through his wrinkles. "Seems the Lord's river runs clear again," he said. "Blue as truth." Luke looked at Clara. Blue as home. For the first time in Dust Hollow's long, weary history, no one looked at them as outsiders. They walked through the town square together, soldier, woman, and dog, toward a life neither had dared to imagine. And down by the river, where the thawed earth met the sky, wildflowers began to bloom. Chapter 7. The House by the River. Spring had come to Dust Hollow as softly as a secret. The river no longer roared. It whispered. Its surface glimmered with light, 1,000 little suns rippling across the water. Wildflowers had returned to the meadows, painting the land in soft strokes of blue and gold. The air smelled of pine-zone and thawed earth, the scent of new beginnings. Clara Jenkins stood at the edge of her rebuilt garden, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in soil. Her hair, once dull from hardship, now caught the sunlight in strands of warm chestnut. She had gained color in her cheeks and strength in her shoulders, a quiet grace that came not from beauty but from endurance. Behind her, Luke Harper lifted a plank into place on the half-finished porch. He had shaved his beard short, though the silver still glinted at his jawline, and he moved with a deliberate steadiness, each hammer strike sure, unhurried. The limp remained, a scar of memory more than pain, but there was a lightness to him now. The furrow between his brows had softened. Rusty trotted nearby, tail wagging, one ear slightly bent from his last fight, a mark that only made him look prouder, more distinguished. The dog was never far from either of them, often seen sitting by the riverbank as if guarding both their past and their future. The house rose slow and honest. Built from timber, they hauled themselves from the nearby ridge. The walls smelled of fresh pine, and the roof beams carried faint scorch marks from the old fire, a reminder that some things must burn before they can stand again. Neighbors began to visit, bringing laughter that once never crossed their threshold. Bess Calhoun arrived with a basket of wild honey and advice about curtains. Reverend Pike came with his weathered Bible and a smile that melted even Luke's reserve. Every home, he told them, needs walls that hold love tighter than fear. Luke chuckled. Then this one's near indestructible. As the days stretched into weeks, word spread that there would be a wedding by the river, the first in Dust Hollow in nearly a decade. It wasn't Clara's idea, nor Luke's. It was Rusty's fault, or so the town joked. The old shepherd had developed a habit of carrying small bundles, sticks, gloves, scraps of cloth, to anyone who visited. When he brought Bess Calhoun one of Clara's ribbons, she laughed and declared it a proposal sign. Within days, half the town was planning a ceremony. Clara protested at first. "We don't have money for grand things." Luke smiled, eyes warm. "Then we'll make it small, but real." On the morning of the wedding, the sky was an endless blue. The townsfolk gathered by the riverbank, dressed in their Sunday best. There were flowers tied to wagon wheels, and a few children chased Rusty around, who barked proudly in his new collar of braided leather. The preacher stood beneath a willow tree whose branches brushed the water. Clara wore a simple white dress Bess had sewn by hand. Its fabric fluttered like breath, and in her hair she tucked a wild rose, the same kind she'd stitched into her coat months before. Luke wore his cleaned-up cavalry jacket, the brass buttons polished, the cane resting lightly against his leg. When he saw her walking toward him, the world seemed to fall silent. Reverend Pike began softly, "Love, like this river, changes everything it touches." As the vows were exchanged, Rusty trotted forward, carrying a small velvet pouch in his mouth. The crowd laughed and wiped their eyes as the dog presented the rings with a dignified little wag. Luke knelt to take his, whispering, "Good boy," before sliding the ring onto Clara's finger. "I've lost everything before," Clara said, her voice trembling, "but I found myself again, in you and this foolish, loyal dog." Luke squeezed her hands, his rough palms warm. "No one's ever truly lost," he said. "Not if someone's waiting for them to come home." The crowd cheered. Music rose, a fiddle played by young Thomas Avery, the deputy clerk, awkward but heartfelt. Couples danced on the grass. Rusty barked at the sound, then joined the children splashing by the river's edge. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in molten orange, Luke and Clara stood by the porch of their new home. The air shimmered with the hum of crickets and laughter fading into evening. Rusty lay nearby, head on his paws, watching the river as though it were alive. "You ever think we'd get here?" Clara asked softly. Luke looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Every night I thought about it, and every morning I tried to believe it." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "The river's blue again." He nodded. "So are we." They stood like that as the light faded. Two survivors of storm and fire and loneliness, now wrapped in peace so fragile it felt like grace. The wind carried the faintest echo of laughter from the town, of hooves, of life continuing. And when the first stars appeared, Rusty lifted his head, gave a single contented bark, as if confirming to the heavens that his work here was done, and went back to sleep. The house by the river glowed in the twilight, its windows golden, its walls alive with the sounds of home. Beyond it, the water whispered its endless hymn, carrying their reflections down into the valley. Two souls, one loyal heart, and a river that had finally learned how to heal. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles wrapped in thunder or light. Sometimes he sends them quietly, in the form of a tired cowboy, a loyal dog, or a woman who refuses to stop believing. In the stillness of hardship, he whispers, "You are not forgotten." Maybe that's the real miracle. Not the storm ending, but the courage to stand again when it passes. So tonight, if you're watching this and carrying your own burden, may you remember, even when the world turns its back, God is still working behind the closed doors of your life. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave us a comment below. Tell us what miracle you're still waiting for. And don't forget to subscribe, so together we can keep spreading stories of faith, kindness, and second chances. May the Lord bless you, and may your heart always find its way home.